That's me, right there in the middle. My name is Fanny Falk. I was born on January 1st, 1927. I live with my mother Ruth and my father Isaac, and my two living siblings, Maxwell and Rose Falk. Max was the oldest, and then there was Rosie just 3 years after him. And 2 years after that, I came along. I had 5 other siblings that I never got to know. Samuel, Esther, Benjamin, Noah, and Gabriel were all killed in the pogroms in Russia in the early 1900s. My parents never imagined they'd move on from that tragedy, but years later they decided to have kids again and raise a family. They lived in Russia until the pogroms ended, when they moved to Gdansk, Poland to start over. We lived a poor life in Gdansk, but our economic state had no bearing on our emotional state. We were very happy living the substandard life that we did. My parents were not afraid to work hard for their income. My parents worked 14-hour days, 6 days a week, and we just barely made ends meet. I slept on a hard cot just barely big enough to fit me. My life was perfectly average, though, by my own standards, until the year 1935, when everything I had known began to change before my eyes. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws began to govern the functionality of societies across Europe. The anti-Semitic morale of German Aryans traveled beyond the borders of Germany. Europe was being taken over, and its citizens were being corrupted by Hitler's depraved beliefs.
I can't explain why we live this way. We do it every day. Preachers on the podium speaking of saints, prophets on the sidewalk begging for change, old ladies laughing from the fire escape, cursing my name.
Als unsere Partei gerade 7 Mann hoch war, sprach sie schon 2 Grundsätze aus. Erstens, sie wollte eine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Zweitens, sie wollte daher kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
Nicht die intellektuellen Schichten haben mir den Mut gegeben, dieses gigantische Werk zu beginnen. Sondern das kann ich sagen, den Mut habe ich nur gefasst, weil ich 2 Schichten kannte, den Bauer und den deutschen Arbeiter. Die kannte ich. Und wir haben nun gearbeitet. Und wir haben in diesen 9 Monaten Ungeheuerliches erreicht. Vielleicht wird manch unter Ihnen sein, der es mir nicht verzeihen kann, dass ich die marxistischen Parteien vernichtete. Aber mein Freund, ich habe die anderen genauso vernichtet. Sie sind
While the laws themselves did not prohibit kindness and civil behavior between non-Jews and Jews, most non-Jews took it to mean that they should not have any sort of contact with people of Jewish descent. For me, this meant that I lost my best friends this year, as well as the respect of my teachers and peers. The only friend I kept through this experience was a Jewish boy named Joseph. He was one of the only other Jewish kids in my school. We didn't know each other very well until school life became hostile. From that point on, he was my closest and only friend. We continued to grow together as a result of our common history. Aside from that, he was sweet, caring, and always protected me at school. While Joseph was not afraid to hear the insults and stereotypes that were dished out at us, my self-esteem was deeply traumatized by it. I had done very well in my school until mid-1935, when the condescending attitudes of nearly everyone I knew took their toll. I didn't even have the desire to do well anymore. As good as I did, it would always be looked down upon, or less than in comparison to the rest of my class. Joseph came by every day after school so we could discuss what went on that day. He tried to get my interest in school back on track, but I told him it was a useless battle. I just didn't want to be so harshly compared and cheated by my own friends and teachers. We ended up venting about all the hostility, cruel remarks, and even abuse that we endured at school. My siblings and I stayed home today. We were feeling sick and were afraid we would be beaten for coughing or sneezing out of turn. Non-Jewish teachers seemed to find it rude when Jews performed the same bodily functions as Aryans. The only difference was that Aryans saw the Jews as extraterrestrial or supernatural, so it was automatically absurd. We had just heard from our family radio of the terrible events in Germany. They called it Kristallnacht. It was tragic. Many Jewish men and women were murdered, their shops were destroyed, their books were burned, and their families were broken. We were thankful that it had happened in Germany and not Poland. But we prayed for our brothers and sisters and blessed their names as we said the Kaddish to our God in their honor. To my own despair, I told my father that I had overheard a non-Jewish girl at the market discussing and chuckling at the glory and success of Kristallnacht in Germany. She said she had heard of numerous instances of Aryan supremacists mocking the events in Poland. My father came home at the usual 8:30 p.m. after working tirelessly for 14 hours. As he walked in the door to the ground floor of our apartment building, my father noticed cries and screams from the street. He peeked outside, and before he could blink, his throat was being held by the firm grasp of a Nazi soldier. He hissed, "How many are in your family?" My father choked back, "It is just me and my mother who live here, but my mother is out looking for food." With the hope that his lies would keep the man from searching and killing his own family upstairs, he was actually relieved when the soldier dragged him by his long, thick hair into the middle of the street. But when he looked up, he saw the terror-stricken faces of his family peering down at him as the Nazi kicked his stomach in and shot him in the back of the head. Mama screamed through the pillow she held over her mouth as she watched her true love perish before her eyes. Then the Nazis reached in the back of their van and grabbed several stones the size of their fists and threw them at the Jewish-owned bookstore across the street. They laughed their evil laughs as they tore down the shelves of books, packing them in suitcases large enough to fit a grown man. While half the men were collecting books by the thousands to burn in an endless, smoldering fire, the other malicious men ran up the back stairwell of our building. They stormed in and out of every room in our 3-story building, packing more bags with the few valuables in our homes that were maybe on top of a dresser or beside the bed. Some families were even robbed of their brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers. When they approached our door, they must have known that this was the man's home who they beat in the street, because when they came in, they went straight for my mother, who looked well beyond her years, old enough to be my grandmother as a result of her taxing work and meticulous ethic. My siblings and I were hiding in the tiny room, praying. We knew that we would be found if the soldiers took more than 3 steps in our house past our mother. They would have noticed the bathroom door wide open. To our surprise, they took our mother and left.
No, I ain't gonna.
My parents' lives were taken that night. I'd imagine that if they were able to reflect on their own deaths, they would have seen it as a bittersweet sacrifice. They both perished, but they died as heroes. They saved their children. My parents would not just be the next statistic in a death toll. They died for a purpose, to keep their children alive and in honor of their religion. That is how I will always remember my parents.
Sing it on the street, drunk to a cop. Oh, I ain't gonna lose you.
My siblings and I now lived alone. Max went to work in my father's place, and Rosie and I quit school and worked as seamstresses for the one German friend we had left that would still speak to us. Bridget Schmidt was her name. I will always remember her because she gave me the first meal after my parents were taken from us. Since they died, I hadn't eaten a meal. 3 days had gone by, and the only food I had eaten for the past 3 days was partially moldy carrots that I found in the trash can outside the local market. With my mother and father not at work, Max, Rosie, and I did not make enough money to support even our small family. Children didn't make as much as adults, and the fact that we were Jewish lowered our pay to well below minimum wage. Bridget cooked us chicken, potatoes, and sweet peas, and told my sister and I to take it home in our seamstress bags so no one would suspect anything or tackle us to get their hands on some food.